Welcome to all of you to my hometown. I live in San Mateo, about a mile from here. So this was the best conference ever from my perspective. What I wanted to do today was talk a little bit about blended learning. Some of our research, we'll start like 60,000 feet high, if that's possible, and do super theoretical and some of the stuff we're starting to think about. And I'll be very candid that the work is in progress. So we're kind of doing the sneak preview of it because we'd love your feedback on it. If we're missing things, ways to clarify, things we can strengthen, and so forth. And then the second part of it is I'll come down to maybe 20,000 feet and do a look at some research that's going to be released in the next couple of weeks, just on sort of a revision of the blended learning taxonomy and the different models that we're actually seeing in the field. And then hopefully that'll lay the groundwork for people who are much more expert in how this actually works on the ground, and you guys can have that conversation. Quick show of hands, because I don't want to do things that are really familiar to the people inside this room, which is how many people have heard me do the disruptive innovation theory piece of the talk? Actually, I should ask it a different way. Yes, you've heard it 15 times. I know, Brian. How many people have not heard? Okay, that's super helpful. So I'm going to do, so for those who have heard it, I apologize, but I'm going to do part of that again just so we're all on the same page, and then we'll walk into why I think it's interesting. And I have to comment on David's comment as well about him being the director of all weird programs, because I'm spending a lot of time now thinking about higher education and disruptive innovation in higher education and the opportunities there. And it's funny, right? Because everyone says, well, gee, it started with the quote-unquote non-traditional student, and then they'll put like age 26 to 36 or something like that, or I can't remember the exact, 25 to 34, and working adult and whatever else. And when you look at it, that's going, non-traditional is going to be a really unfortunate word for that really soon, because that's actually going to be the majority. So I think we're going to have the same thing in a few more years in K-12 as well. So. Weird certainly has worked in higher ed. So, so I'll dive in and talking about both disruptive innovation and sustaining innovation. I work at Innosight Institute, for those of you who don't know. It's a nonprofit think tank I co-founded about 5 years ago to apply the theories of disruptive innovation to problems in the social sector. And we've done a lot of research on blended learning over the last, say, year and a half or so. We came out with a report in January of the year prior that gave a definition to blended learning, and observed at the time that there were 6 models coming out. We haven't really applied our theories of innovation to this phenomenon, though, and we have 2 papers coming out in the next several months. The one that'll be coming out in 2 weeks from now is going to be looking at that taxonomy again and updating it based on a ton of feedback from over 100 educators over the last year or so. And then the second thing that'll be coming out, which is a little bit longer time horizon. When Teresa originally signed me up, I was thinking it might be out about now, but the way of researchers is to always miss your deadlines. And that one will be actually applying the theories. So I'm going to start with that one, and so in reverse order, just so when you guys get email blasts from us or Twitter feeds from Rob and Q, that you know what is what and what you've heard. I'm going to start with the theoretical one that's a little bit further away from being published and we're still struggling with. What I've done here is plot a bunch of circles, and concentric circles actually being the operative word. The innermost circle represents those customers and users with the most wealth or expertise in a market. And as you go out successive circles, it represents people with comparatively less wealth or less expertise. And basically, you can think of any market as following this pattern where it starts really centralized with the people with the most money and most expertise, and over time it becomes more and more decentralized such that it can serve more people. And so in the inner circle, you can actually characterize the action there through this simple little graph, where what I've done is plot on the y-axis performance, and it's over time on the x-axis. And what we see in every circle is that there are 2 trajectories of performance. The first one is this relatively flat line, and it's the pace of performance that customers can utilize or absorb over time. And the reason it's relatively flat is because our basic lives don't actually change that much from day to day, right? The things that you had to get done yesterday are something like what you have to do tomorrow and so forth. Of course, we have a range. There's some people at the low end who are satisfied with very little in the way of performance, and there's some people at the high end who we all have the misfortune of working with. I'm just kidding, Kelly. It's early in the morning. Who we all have the misfortune of working with, who are never satisfied no matter how much you give them in the way of performance. So now there's a second line, and this is the really interesting one, which is the pace of technological improvement. And what it says is that every technology starts as not good enough for the majority of users in a field, but technology improves faster than do our lives change. So what at one point isn't good enough for the majority of us, over time packs in more and more functions and features such that it actually overshoots what most of us need from a technology. So I'll just a quick example. If you remember the early personal computers in the early 1980s, and you remember they could barely do word processing, you had to stop every once in a while and coax the stupid thing to catch up with your fingers. But Intel, the microprocessor, wasn't fast enough for a basic application like word processing. They improved it year over year and marched up that blue line till now they introduced multi-core whatever processors that actually give us way more speed than the majority of us need. Now, sometimes those march up that blue line are just year-to-year incremental improvements. Other times they're just giant breakthrough leaps forward. But what we realized was that breakthrough innovations and the year-to-year incremental innovations were actually the same type of innovation. They're both sustaining innovations in that they allow the people or the technologies on that blue line to sustain that performance, to make bigger, better, more performance, things that they can often charge for more dollars, and so forth. And incumbents, the leading organizations at the beginning of that blue line, are unbelievably good at being the leaders at the end of that blue line as well. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but sometimes you'll see a high-flying entrant come in and try to leapfrog the field. And if you look back a couple years later, they'll invariably withdraw or pull back or be acquired because they're so motivated to serve their existing user base that the incumbents will figure out ways to get it done. Now, occasionally there was this other kind of innovation come along called a disruptive innovation that would come out into this outer circle and serve people that couldn't access that innermost technology because they didn't have that wealth and expertise. They were what we call non-consumers. They literally could not consume that innermost circle. And this new innovation would come along that, as judged by this performance, was actually not as good as the leading technologies of the time, as judged by whatever that performance metric was. And because it wasn't as good, it couldn't plant itself in the center there, but it would actually redefine the definition of performance and therefore come out into this outer circle as it would define it around something around affordability, convenience, accessibility, simplicity, things like that would enable these non-consumers to now be able to use the technology. And what we noticed was that entrants would typically win at battles of disruptive innovation. For some reason, this decentralization, this move out, was really hard for the incumbents in the inner circle to catch that wave of disruptive innovation. So I'll give you just a quick example of how this played out in another market, and then we can talk about where else we've seen it. But before the advent of computers, when we wanted to do computing some 60, 70 years ago, we all sort of were at the fringes of this world, and we whipped out our slide rule whenever we had a computing problem and did it. And it was the advent of the mainframe computers in the 40s and 50s that created an industry and really centralized the action of computing. It cost a couple $1 million or so to own a mainframe computer. So the majority of us just sort of existed out here and never interacted with a computer, right? Then a relative disruptive innovation was these mini computers made by people like Digital Equipment Corporation and companies like that. These cost about $250,000 to own, so it still wasn't terribly accessible, but it allowed comparatively more people now to have access to computing. And what was interesting was Digital Equipment Corporation, when they were sitting there. They were the leading company of their time. They were literally, right, the best company, the Google sort of that era, or I guess we should now say Facebook, since they're about to make the Valley go really crazy in the next month. But that just amazing company at the time. You even look at the quotes from their CEO back in the 80s and stuff like that, as he would just disparage all the other General Electrics and IBMs of the world and just say, no one's created something like we have. And whenever you read in management journals and Business Week and Wall Street Journal and places like that why they were so good, they always said the leaders are really, really smart and always make the right decisions. And they're just the smartest guys around. But an interesting, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, what was that called?
Digital Equipment Corporation, or DEC.
That was being pretty.
Yeah, mini computers. Sorry, mini computers, yeah, sorry. So this is like 1970s and 80s. And so DEC, yeah, and by the way, guys, just interrupt whenever and ask questions. So DEC, in 1989, though, the company literally collapsed, really rapidly fell off a cliff. And you'd go back and say, well, what happened? And they'd say it was the stupid leaders at the top that missed the personal computer wave. Literally the very same people running the company. And so the question, my co-author, so personal computers had come up underneath them. We'll talk about it in a second. But people, Clay Christensen, my co-author, entered academia at this time. And the question he brought with him was, why do successful organizations fail? But he also asked, why do smart people decide to become stupid? Because that's literally, right, how everyone would frame failure, not just in this industry, but look at anything right now in the news. We always ascribe the failure of others to stupidity somehow. But it literally didn't make any sense in this case because every single mini computer company collapsed in the same 6-month time period. Data General, Prime, Wang, Hewlett, every single one. And while you'd expect companies to collude on price occasionally, to collude to collapse, a bit of a stretch in the imagination, and yet that's exactly what happened. And basically, what had happened was the personal computer, which had started out as a disruptive innovation, right, out on this fringe, barely good enough as a toy for children, certainly couldn't do word processing, had gotten good enough that it had taken the volume out of the market. And one by one, people came out to this disruptive innovation, and the world was transformed. Now, the challenge, and I'll just abbreviate here, but the challenge for DEC and the leaders there was actually, if you were in their position and you were hearing your customers say, we'd like you to build a next generation mini computer that was even bigger and better and did more things and you could charge $500,000 instead of $250,000, or you said, gee, you can come out to this little fringe area and build this dimpy little thing that can barely do word processing and you can only charge a couple $1,000s for it, and there's some guy named Jobs that's building a bunch of these out of his garage, what would you choose to do? More prestigious, more money, better performance, harder computing problems. You never naturally would go out to this outer fringe and do that because that's not as interesting. It's not as good. And yet, so the story of good management is actually the upshot of the very logical thing and continued to build bigger and better. The problem was that disruptive innovation ultimately spelled them as it got good enough that it could take the volume out of the market. And Apple and companies like that had a really luxurious decision when they got started, which was they just got to ask the simple question, who would want a personal computer? Because they had no customers that needed serving when they got started. And so they looked to offer their first machine as a toy to children and hobbyists for whom the alternative was literally nothing at all. So they didn't care that it was quote unquote not good because from their perspective it was awesome. And then we've seen obviously notebooks and netbooks and now handheld phones that have more power in them than all the computers that took the first man to the moon on them in your pockets. We've seen that disruptive innovation wave continue. For time's sake, I'll sort of blow through this, but we've basically seen this phenomenon happen in lots of sectors. So automotive, Toyota started with the crummy car called the Corona that rusted really quickly, but then they got better and displaced GM. And every once in a while, GM and Ford would send out a Pinto or a Chevette into the outer circle to try to compete with these guys, but it never made sense to keep pushing in that direction when you had the prestige and honor of selling yet another Cadillac Escalade or Ford Explorer. Toyota's being disrupted now by Hyundai and the Koreans, who basically own the subcompact and compact ends of the market. We made fun of their quality about 10 years ago. Now they're winning all the quality awards. Underneath them are the Chinese and Chery, who I'm sure we never need worry about the Chinese, but yeah. So department stores disrupted by discount retail, Kmart, Walmart, Target. Target turned itself into Target, and online retail has come up underneath them. And interestingly enough, Target.com is not run by Target, it's run by Amazon, right? You see this continually through state universities, an interesting one given the education audience. I'm not sure you would say community colleges have been disruptive to them because there was no technology enabler underneath it, but it did decentralize and allow far more people to have access to a post-secondary education. And online universities really are a disruptive innovation, and I wrote a piece about it that got some attention last week in Forbes, for better or worse. Brian liked it at least. So talked about that disruptive phenomenon, and now we're seeing a lot more disruptive innovations getting launched in the last 6 months in higher education from MIT, Udacity, Coursera just got $16 million yesterday out of Stanford. It's like, talk about heating up. So our observation was that K-12 education, online learning, was having these same traits, but we'll talk about that in a moment. The interesting question is, what are the existing organizations, what's their natural instinct when they see a disruptive innovation developing? And for this story, if you go back to the 1950s and 60s to the consumer electronics industry, the big consumer electronics at the time were tabletop radios and floor-standing televisions powered by vacuum tubes, which were about the size of your fist. They blew out every once in a while, but they enabled some unbelievable technological marvels at the time. And RCA and Zenith, companies like that, were the leaders in this industry. And in 1947, out of Bell Laboratories, scientists there invented the transistor, which was disruptive relative to the vacuum tubes. It couldn't handle the power that these power-hungry devices could handle, but it was much smaller. It was much more durable. It didn't blow out every 6 months or so. And all of the vacuum tube companies saw this technology and said, this is exciting. They didn't have the language of disruption, but they said, this is exciting. We're going to take a license to it. And then they shoved it in their labs and started to do research and development on it, and literally spent over $2 billion collectively, adjusted for today's money, in trying to perfect the transistor, basically framing it as a technology problem, saying if we just get it good enough, we'll just swap it in for our vacuum tubes, and our consumers will have no idea the difference and just keep on purchasing. And so the path that they took was to cram it into their current business model, into their current operating model. And despite spending all that money, the technological hurdle was so high that they just never got there. It never, ever made sense to make that swap. And even today, vacuum tubes actually enable more raw performance from power-hungry devices than do transistors. The steady incremental improvement of vacuum tubes has just defied the ability of transistor to catch up completely. Now, transistor, though, of course, has transformed our lives in some considerable ways. And the way it did it was by coming out to this outer circle of non-consumption and planting itself there. And the first application was a hearing aid. So this was a perfect device for a transistor because the vacuum tube was totally impractical for it. And it didn't need much power, and the transistor couldn't handle much power, right? So it was a great way to start it in 1952. In 1955, this company no one had heard of called Sony out of Japan came out with this pocket transistor radio. And this thing was a crummy device as judged by the old metrics of performance. It was tinny, it was static-laced. Clay Christensen grew up in Utah. You had to face west if you wanted to get a signal on the stupid thing. But Sony had this really interesting insight, which was we'll sell it to the low end of humanity, true non-consumers, people we call teenagers today, who will be just delighted with this crummy product because for them it's not crummy at all. It's way better than their alternative, nothing at all. It only costs $2 to own and buy one. And they can drop it in their shirt pocket and go out of earshot of their parents and listen to their rock and roll music. And it got better and better, and in 1959 they introduced the portable television. Again, not as good as the raw power of the floor-standing TVs, but for people who had small apartments and small pocketbooks that couldn't afford floor-standing televisions, this was an awesome thing. And it got better and better and better, and by 1960s it was good enough such that people rushed out into this outer circle, delighted with something that was more affordable, more convenient to own, and so forth. And you saw that the customers were enticed out of the old system and into the new, not vice versa. And literally RCA and all the vacuum tube businesses vaporized. And it was a truly painful story because they saw the transistor before Sony did. They invested more money than Sony did. And yet Sony lived to tell about it, and RCA's consumer electronics business did not. And it sort of speaks to this instinct that we're having in education right now as well, where everyone is seeing the disruptive innovation of online learning and asking, how do we port it into the inner circle? And expensive failure is what happens when you frame the problem like that. And indeed, in education, we've done exactly that over the last many years. Before online learning even got its legs and computers came out and we got excited about them, what we did was cram it into the core curriculum, shoved computers into the back of classrooms, created keyboarding labs to teach students about keyboarding, but we never actually fundamentally changed the architecture of learning itself and took the actual route that we could. And so we actually spent a lot of money investing in hardware and software. It's to this instinct that we're having in education right now as well, where everyone is seeing the disruptive innovation of online learning and asking, how do we port it into the inner circle?
Actually, this is just a
And
graphic.
expensive failure is what happens when you frame the problem like that. And indeed, in education, we've done exactly that over the last many years. Before online learning even got its legs and computers came out and we got excited about them, what we did was cram it into the core curriculum, shoved computers into the back of classrooms, created keyboarding labs to teach students about keyboarding, but we never actually fundamentally changed the architecture of learning itself and took the actual route that we could. And so we actually spent a lot of money investing in hardware and software. To this instinct that we're having in education right now as well, where everyone is seeing the disruptive innovation of online learning and asking, how do we port it into the inner circle?
Actually, this is just a
And expensive failure is what happens when you frame the problem like that. And indeed, in education, we've done exactly that over the last many years. Before online learning even got its legs and computers came out and we got excited about them, what we did was cram it into the core curriculum, shoved computers into the back of classrooms, created keyboarding labs to teach students about keyboarding, but we never actually fundamentally changed the architecture of learning itself and took the actual route that we could. And so we actually spent a lot of money investing in hardware and software. To this instinct that we're having in education right now as well, where everyone is seeing the disruptive innovation of online learning and asking, how do we port it into the inner circle?
Actually, this is just a
even if it does cost money, but that's the perception. And so I don't know that I see a disruptive innovation of schooling, but I do see a disruptive innovation of the classroom as we've known it. And so everyone always says to me, yeah, well, how do we get this in the classroom? I tend to think it's the wrong question because I see a lot of disruptive innovation there. And I think the looming budget cuts and teacher shortages that we're all facing are actually going to accelerate this in some significant ways in the years ahead and already have. And Brian probably will have much more data on that later today and soon. Yeah. So just noting these areas. And online learning has followed this S-curve pattern of a disruptive innovation, which allowed us to make that crazy prediction in the book that by 2019, 50% of all high school courses would be delivered online in some form or fashion. The interesting thing is that the story is actually a little bit more complicated than what I just painted. While there's definitely a instinct of the leaders to cram technology into what they're currently doing, when the disruptive innovation really materializes, there's another stage that every industry passes through. And this is the one where I wanted to transition into the talk about blended learning and think about what it means. And I want to tell a silly story. How many people remember the book Mike Mulligan and the Steam Shovel? Okay, good. So That's a steam shovel. John's like, he's lost it. So steam shovels used to be these mechanical things that would literally go in and move big piles of dirt with this sort of a motion. You can see a picture of it there coming in, and it would lift it and so forth. And then there's a big...
I just needed the picture, by the way. I didn't know the term.
Now there's a big... it's an Osgood steam shovel, I'll have you know. It was a very important company in the 1950s. So if you look at that new thing that I've put up there, in that era, there was this big technological breakthrough in mechanical shovels, which was to move away from mechanical shovels actually to hydraulics, and to power the shovel by hydraulics, which would have a very different movement for actually picking up dirt and so forth, as opposed to mechanical shovels that came at it like this. They went in like this and would lift it up. And what it enabled you to do was be far more precise about the holes you would dig and so forth. But initially, it was only able to just dig very small holes. It couldn't handle a lot of load in the shovel when it would pick things up. So for people that had very small, precise holes that they wanted to dig in their yard, this was a great thing because they never had access to the mechanical shovels in the past. They were way too expensive and just dug big things imprecisely. But this was, you can see one of the first ones, the Sherman Bobcat, came out and allowed people to do these small little holes. And then, of course, you know the story, right? It got better and better and better and could start to do big holes. And if you actually drive around 101 when you leave here today, and go up and down and see the construction, you'll see that they're all hydraulics. It's actually, now that I'm in this, like I'm actually looking at this constantly now. So what was interesting, though, was that there was this other phase where the leading mechanical shovels actually didn't sit back and just let this happen to them. They came out with this hybrid thing called the hydro hoe. Like, this makes the story worth telling because I get to say that. So you literally can't make this stuff up, right? So the hydro hoe is a completely, it was a combination of mechanical and hydraulics in one. You can actually, I don't know if you can see it here, but the slides will be distributed. There's actually the mechanical pulley systems are there, and then it was but it was a hydraulic mechanism that allowed it to lift it up. And so basically it was a way for them to, they went through this hybrid phase where to stay in business, they incorporated the new technology, trying to ward off these disruptive players and so forth. And ultimately it disappeared, and one by one everything got replaced, and the pure play disruption was what actually won out. But you see this actually in almost every single industry, that the outgoing technology has this phase of hybrids where that they go through en route to the pure play disruption. And so if you think about electric vehicles as an interesting industry right now, it's a classic disruptive innovation, right? It's bringing forth automobiles that can't go very fast and can't go very far. And yet we have these internal combustion engines that we can drive for 400 or 500 miles and so forth, right, and on and on. And the question is, are there customers that would love a car that can't go fast and can't go far? And I would posit actually that there are, even though we're just starting to see it, which is teenagers, so parents would love a car where their kids can't go very fast and far. And in old age communities also, actually, right? If you actually go to Arizona, out to like Surprise, Arizona, which is about an hour outside of Phoenix, is that about right? I think so. They're already driving those cars, exactly, right? You literally go around, they're all driving basically electric golf carts. It's fascinating, right? And so this is a classic place for the disruptive innovation to get its start. What you notice is in the Bay Area, Tesla has come in at the high end with this $100,000 electric vehicle, trying to compete on all these traditional metrics of automobiles. And what you could actually predict with some certainty is, well, this is a longer conversation, but Tesla probably isn't going to transform the market and beat the existing Toyota players and so forth through this jumping, sustaining innovation strategy. We can almost predict that with some certainty, but hybrid vehicles, of course, are actually a great sustaining innovation in that inner circle that Toyota and lots of others have brought to market, and really taking the electric technology and combining it with the old internal combustion engine. You've also seen it in photography, right? When digital cameras came out, we still printed them out, actually, in very analog format for a long time. We take them to the drugstore. People still do. And then the pure play with smartphones and the cameras, where we just upload them to Facebook, or if you're like me now, Google Plus, whenever I snap a photo, it just naturally sucks it out of my phone and uploads it to Google, and I think lets all my friends know that I've done something. But I'm not quite sure, because I still don't fully understand Google Plus. But if you do, let me know afterwards. So we've seen it in photography. We've seen it in almost any industry you can think of. There's this hybrid phase before the pure play disruption goes on. And what I would suggest is it's actually not always clear that the market always switches right away, or maybe at all, to a pure play disruption, or at least it's over many, many, many decades. So I'll give you one more example in computing. Workstations were really a hybrid play by mainframes to try to stay relevant in the personal computer conversation. Banking is a really interesting one because it demonstrates the other one, right? Branch banks with online banking and ATMs, both very obvious potential disruptive innovations. That hybrid form of having both is still around some. Well, ATMs were, what, in the 60s? And online banking in the last 15, 20 years. We haven't seen that final disruption by any means, and I'm not sure we're headed there anytime soon in the next 20 years anyway. So hybrids actually play a very important role in the evolution of a market, and those sustaining innovations are actually really, really important. But it's important, I think, to understand what is what and start to parse it out. Because of the implications for where you can predict things will go over time and so forth. So you've seen that before. And so this gets us to blended learning, or hybrid learning, as people call. And it looks like it has these classic attributes that shouldn't actually have surprised us in many ways. But I think the story is a little more complicated. So let me first dive into the paper that'll be coming out in the next 2 weeks, which we've tightened the definition of blended learning a little bit based on lots of feedback from folks, which is it's a formal education program in which a student is learning, at least in part, through online delivery of instruction and content, a key part of the INACOL definition that was not in ours before, with some element of student control over time, place, path, and/or pace, and at least in part at a supervised brick-and-mortar location away from home, which generally is meant as school, but as John has told me, not necessarily. And this is our definition of blended learning. It's still not capturing, sorry.
Just keep talking, we'll type.
Tweet. Okay, good. It's still not talking about a technology-rich environment. So this is not blended learning where we're just beaming an electronic whiteboard. One-to-one laptops or digital textbooks are very clearly not blended learning either, because there hasn't been that shift. This is still the cramming mode, is what I would say. And it's not the sustaining innovation of taking online learning and combining it with that face-to-face environment in the way we've seen the hybridization in other fields. And what we've seen is that we're having several different blended learning models emerge. And what I would say is that I think all of them, in some way, with the exception of the last one, are probably sustaining innovations to school as we've known it. But not all of them, some of them are disruptive to class, but some of them are actually sustaining innovations to the classroom. And that's where I think we're going to actually see a big difference. And I think that the sustaining innovations to the classroom as we've known it is what's getting a lot of hype right now in the charter school community. And we can talk about this and try to parse it out in a moment. And this is where we're sort of playing with. So In the new taxonomy, we're going to come out with 4 models, which a few people in this room have already seen because they've been throwing darts at it for the last several months. Actually, one other thing, Rob, I want to single you out actually on the definition of blended learning itself, because there's a third part we're going to hi everyone. There's a third part we're going to put in the paper and suggest as an optional part of the definition, but not require it, which is that element of control over time, place, path, and/or pace has to somehow inform the other modalities in which the student is learning in the subject area. And we're not comfortable enough that the field is with us to put that in the main definition, but I kind of think that's really important and resolves, we're in video, resolves some of the rocket ship education questions we've been debating and would be in a controversial way. And I'm not ready to get out in front of the field with that, but I think it's a question. So it's right, but I think that's something that when it comes out, you guys should all weigh in on and jump on, because I think it's an interesting point and it's something we sort of tried to take the middle road on, but I think it's an interesting question. So, sorry, back to the taxonomy, because we're all working on this, right? And we hope this in particular will continue to evolve. When we came out with our report about a year and a half ago, we came out with 6 different blended learning models. We've now come down to 4, and the reason is because of further innovation in the field, but also a couple of the models that we had suggested did not actually look like distinct models unto themselves that were very clearly blended learning. There was too much overlap with some of the other ones, and what we wanted to do was kind of come out one more level of abstraction, loosen up the definitions a little bit to allow a lot of different things into the models so that we could have a common language and talk about this. That's sort of the design principle we took with it. The rotation model is one in which, within a given subject, students are rotating from online learning and then at fixed points in time to other modalities of learning. And what's critical is in the online learning that they're actually getting instruction and content delivery there. So that's a definition update to make that very clear. You can't just be moving to a computer where you're applying something or doing a project on there. While that may be a great form of learning, it's not blended learning. So we're trying to make that distinction. And in the field right now, we think we're seeing 4 types of rotation models emerge, although John raised an interesting question to me to our team over email on the last one last night, so we can talk about that in a moment. But the flipped classroom. Station rotation model is within a given classroom, students are literally rotating from different stations around the classroom, so one of which would be online learning, where they're getting delivery of content and so forth. And then at fixed periods of time, we say rotate and so forth. The station rotation is a very familiar model to elementary schools already. It just wasn't necessarily with technology at the heart of it, which is why I think this is a total sustaining innovation to the classroom as we've known it. The lab rotation is what rocket ship education in San Jose has popularized. We'll look at it in a second, but it's where students are literally rotating within a course between a traditional classroom and then a learning lab where they're doing online delivery of content and instruction. Again, I think this is a sustaining innovation. It's basically the classroom figuring out a way to bring in online learning technologies to bolster what it does and operates. Individual rotation, I'll talk about. I think that's actually getting potentially more on the disruptive side of the classroom question. I'll talk about what that is in a moment. The flipped classroom, we put it there because we felt like the field was just using the term so much that for us not to acknowledge that it was being thought of as blended learning was sort of missing something. And I'll talk about what our definition of that we're working with is in a moment. The flex model is really one of the ubiquitous forms of online learning that occurs today. It's where the online, now instead of the classroom being the platform where we've added a piece of online learning technology, now we've flipped it. The online learning is the platform. That's the disruptive play. and we've snapped it into brick and mortar school environments. And so in many ways, I see this as online learning getting better so that it can serve more kids. And basically, there's face-to-face support, fluid schedules. So there may be other modalities that a student will work on, but it's not determined by a fixed schedule. It's determined by their individual need in a very fluid pace. And either the computer program or the teacher would make that determination. And the teacher is the teacher of record is on site. There may also be online teacher supports and so forth, but the teacher of record is on site in the flex model. The self-blend is the other form of ubiquitous online learning that's been around, and it's where students are attending physical school, taking the majority of the classes there, but taking one or more online courses where the teacher of record is the online teacher. So a lot of times we think of this as distance online learning, but from the student's perspective, they're very clearly blending their learning experiences. And to not put this in the taxonomy, we thought was a mistake, but it's also very clearly a disruptive innovation to the classroom when you're in that self-blend environment, because it's radically changed that notion, as has the Flex one. The enriched virtual is basically like a full-time virtual school, except for that within a given course, students have to check in at the physical school on required basis at a fixed time. And we're not talking about something like, you come in for field trips or for a ice cream social once a month or a summer school enrichment program. We're talking like every week there's some aspect of the program that has a face-to-face supplementation of it. John pointed out to us in an email, I keep calling you out for something you don't remember. Okay. So the question was, in this definition, do we have to put some amount of time that's required to make it clear that it's different from the full-time virtual? I think the answer is yes, but I don't know how to do that correctly. So it's something we're thinking about, but right now the required, it's really part of the program notion is how we're thinking about it, and we're hoping that the field can kind of get it. Yeah. I'm thinking of enriched virtual as including that. Yeah. And I'm thinking of it as one and the same, basically. We changed the name to enriched virtual because I think the hassles of public impact yelled at us enough about it. I think that was the origin of it, but yeah. Kelly.
So the distinction between self-blend and enriched virtual
Yeah.
and independent studies. So students come once a week and meet with their teacher, and some of their courses are textbook-based and some of them are online-based. Is that self-blend, enriched virtual, or which of those would you?
That's yeah. So it'd be worth revisiting this. I think it's when we're just talking about the course. Let me make another distinction because I'm struggling with some of these too. The first three of these appear to me to be like models, as in you can have multiple different ones going on within a school. So I could be doing self-blend, I could be doing credit recovery in a flex environment, and I could have a rotation in my social studies course. Enriched virtual appears to me to be a full school thing, right? So I actually think it's distinct from the other three in that regard. Is that?
That's fair. I just needed to know what to title my slide later.
Yeah. Well, I apologize for that, but this has been a bit of a bear to work through and get where people feel like there's consensus. But so really quickly, the station. Yeah. I'm going to come into it in a second. Can we hold off on the question on it till I get to a slide on it? Is that okay? Take the mic, though. Take the mic and just jump in then. Yeah. Just because I'm going to have a specific slide on it, and then we can talk about it. So station rotation is this right, rotating among different modalities. If you're in Los Angeles, you can take a look at KIPP and Power, what they're doing. My gut as a result is that the majority of elementary schools will have very little difficulty moving to a blended learning model in the years ahead because it's going to be a very natural sustaining innovation to their current classroom structures. I just don't think it's going to be very challenging for this to occur. And if you actually go back to our areas of non-consumption we list, I think you'll see that with the exception of maybe after school and homeschool, none of them pertain to elementary education. They are all, like, we just haven't seen big areas of non-consumption in elementary school develop or be exploited. Now, love an innovator to do that. It just hasn't materialized yet. I see you looking funny on that. But high school and middle school, I think, has been a different story, which, again, because of the course modularity that was already there, it was just easier to pick off some of these subjects and so forth. This is the lab rotation model from Rocket Ship, where they're rotating into that learning lab. Again, I think this will be slightly more challenging for most schools to move toward. I think the station rotation is going to be far more prevalent. But I think this is a clear sustaining innovation to the current classroom model, where it's just adding that room, basically. And for those schools that have a computer lab, this will be something that they can start to utilize better in some cases for themselves. Yeah.
What about a school that's a Read 180 lab?
So Read 180 is blended learning, and they've been doing it for 10 years, and it's a classic.
All of the kids, really?
I think it's a classic sustaining innovation.
No, we're going to argue about this one.
But I think Read 180 is a classic sustaining innovation, right? They come in, and they actually have they don't just offer the software. They actually bring a service organization to actually move, when it works right, to move the model itself. And so now you're doing some online instruction of delivery and content, and it's a classic sustaining innovation. It's why it's distinct from the online learning disruptions that we're seeing, that we all know and think of in the field. Yeah.
So then if for 20 years a school has rotated students through a computer lab, then they're going to fit this model.
If they got instruction of delivery and if they got delivery of instruction and content, and I don't think most did. Yeah, go ahead.
So for the last 20 years, a school I work with, their students, every class at the elementary school level rotated through a computer lab and did Read 180 or other programs like that, then it would fit this model of blended learning.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, but and it's why it's a sustaining innovation, right? I think, and that's the distinction we have to start drawing, because of the way the field's talking about it. But it was also, I think, actually extremely rational behavior that you see in every other market. And there is some difference that we may want to parse out at some point. I just don't know how to think about it. So Carpe Diem is an individual rotation model. People familiar with Carpe Diem? Okay. If you're not, check it out online. There's a great video that describes it. But this is more, to me, this is actually, I would think of this as coming from the online learning and moving into a brick and mortar environment. So I tend to think of this as disruptive to class, where students are literally, the predominant experience is that online learning curriculum, which is different from the Read 180 example, right? It's like, it's very different. And that's why we're trying to sort of parse this out. So I think of this as disruptive. The only reason it's a rotation model is because it's every 35 minutes, students rotate to a new modality. Now, it may still be that they rotate to the same modality in which they're already on, because everyone has an individual playlist, but it occurs at fixed times, which made it different from a flex program where every student was doing their own thing when it made sense for them. And what's interesting about the Flex Academy, SF Flex Academy, do people know that school in San Francisco? The one in Silicon Valley, I'm told, is even better to look at as like an exemplar. The San Francisco one is, I think, okay. But they actually have two different models going on in their school. One of them is the Flex model, where the teachers of record are on site from English, math. The core classes are all Flex. And students are doing most of their work on the online curriculum, but when they need to, they rotate out into a small group session or a seminar or work with some students offline or a project or whatever else. For their electives, they're all self-blend model, right? So when they take French, the teacher of record lives online. And so there's actually two different models going on in the SF Flex Academy. I didn't include the flipped classroom. So let's talk about it then. Ask the question, and then let's dive into it.
So when I was looking at your definition and descriptors, it felt to me like a flipped classroom would there are quite a few examples of flipped classrooms that don't have that level of student control.
Yeah.
And in fact, it's very easy to think about a flipped classroom looking like traditional assignment of homework, but with technology instead of paper
Yeah.
books. And what occurs to me, actually, and I was just going back to your document to think about this, I think maybe the way to approach it is to say these models are descriptions of ways to do blended learning, but they can also be done in ways that aren't blended learning. And you have to refer
That's
back
exactly
to
right.
the definition, and it's that student control.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Can you actually write that and send it to me and Heather? Yeah. So I think that's right. So literally work in progress, right? I agree, John. I think, and the distinction we tried to make, right, was that if you were just going online to do some stuff, that wasn't blended learning. But if you were actually delivering the core lessons and you actually had control over some of those elements, then it would be. And so some of the flipped classrooms, I think, are certainly blended learning, and some of them are not. I agree with that.
Michael, on several occasions, you've emphasized the concept of a fixed time rotation.
We're loosening that in the definition a little bit. We're going to do it fixed or teacher prescribed time for the whole class. So it wouldn't be like every 35 minutes, but the teacher says, hey, everyone, we're rotating to the next thing now. Would be
Regardless of whether or not the kid's ready to rotate.
correct. Yeah.
So how would you define an option where the student and the teacher both have a role in choosing when to rotate?
I would think that would start to move toward flex. I would think that's a flex model. But I'm not convinced I'm right. We know that's a gray area, and we're struggling with it. Yeah. Poke holes there, because that's one of the ones that we've really. So we changed the language to not make it fixed schedule completely for that very reason. I think it's difficult.
So when the report came out initially, we were all kind of surprised by where you put us.
I'm trying to remember where we put you.
Yeah, which I think was up in the upper right-hand quadrant of your grid. Because when we walk around the school, we see multiple different applications.
Yeah, so this is great, right? So what this will do, we hope, with this revision, is say that actually to think that a program is one thing is wrong, right? That most programs actually have a couple different things going on, and you're mixing and matching blended programs, right? Yeah, it's a really important point. So let me try to situate it then along the spectrum, and I think, Rob, you'll like this one better. The next slide, not this one, the next one. Wait for it. So basically, we have brick and mortar experience and online learning sort of on these two sides, and blended learning obviously sitting in there. I think what you're going to be able to do is say that these are your sustaining innovations here. And then my guess is that the disruptive innovations will start here. And they basically come from the online learning world in. And these are basically the brick and mortar experience trying to grab onto technology to hold on. And that's how I think this world is going to flip out. And this is the paper that I'm most interested in. That's a few months away still. But then we can also situate it with this, right, which is traditional instruction being here. You would have tech-rich instruction here. So this is like we just gave you some technology to do something, do an experiment, a whiteboard. This would be the cramming area, but also a lot of project-based learning would fall into here where how many people looked at the Digital Learning Day town hall meeting on February 1st? People check that out. They had a bunch of examples of a school in Colorado, actually. Very cool school. Doing some really neat stuff with technology that I would not call blended learning at all. And basically they had digital cameras and scanners and all these things that they were doing real projects and so forth. It's not actually delivery of content and instruction and things like that make it online learning. And then these would be, and then full-time or online learning probably should be represented off the slide, but bear with me. But basically, blended learning is sitting in the middle of that, and you have this really continuum of the sustaining versus the disruptive, and that's how we're thinking of it right now. So that's my that's my talk. But I appreciate you guys like, what's that? Yeah, that's my story. I'm sticking to it. No, that's my story, and I'm obviously not sticking to it because you guys are continuing to push us. So but that sustaining disruptive thing, I'm hoping is going to be really helpful for the field in parsing out what we're seeing. Because I'd argue that the majority, we're in an interesting time in California, right, with the budget cuts, where I think every single charter organization across the state is moving to blended learning right now. I don't think any of us would look at what they're doing, though, and say it was what we're talking about when we think about blended learning, where it's truly a disruptive innovation. I think they're all using it as a sustaining innovation. And I think that's going to be very clarifying for the field is my hope, just to parse it out. I just hope we can do it in a way that is clear. And I hope it sort of lifts some of the fog over this when we do it. So thanks, guys.